The blizzard howled like 1,000 angry wolves, cutting through the Wyoming mountains with merciless fury. Snow particles stung like needles against any exposed skin, and the wind screamed between the pines with such force it threatened to uproot trees that had stood for centuries. Visibility was reduced to mere feet, turning the familiar landscape into a disorienting white void. The blizzard of '85 changed everything, Daniel Hawkins said, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee as he gazed out the window of his ranch house. At 68, his face was a topographical map of a life lived outdoors, each line telling its own story of hardship and triumph. His grandson James leaned forward in his chair, eyes wide with anticipation. The boy had heard fragments of this story over the years, but never the full account. Outside, the gentle Wyoming summer evening stood in stark contrast to the tale about to unfold. You see, son, before that storm, I had accepted that the Hawkins line would end with me. I had made my peace with it, or so I thought. Daniel's voice carried the weight of memory, transporting them both back 30 years to that fateful day in 1885. The scene shifted, colors fading into the sepia tones of memory. Daniel at 38, his body strong and capable despite the old war injuries that plagued him on cold mornings. He rode atop his black stallion, Thunder, through the blinding snow, following a trail that only instinct could discern. He had gone out to check the northern fence line when the storm hit, faster and more violent than anyone had predicted. Daniel had turned back immediately, knowing that in such conditions, even a seasoned mountain man could become disoriented and perish. But as Thunder struggled through a particularly deep snowdrift, Daniel heard something that made him pull up short. A voice, faint but unmistakably human, crying out against the howling wind. Daniel turned Thunder toward the sound, squinting against the onslaught of snow. There, barely visible through the white curtain, was a figure stumbling blindly, already half covered in snow. "Help!" the figure called out, voice thin against the storm's roar. "Is anyone there?" Daniel urged Thunder forward, reaching the struggling form in moments. It was a woman dressed in city clothes entirely unsuited for the mountains, much less a blizzard. Her lips were turning blue, and she was clearly in the early stages of hypothermia. Without hesitation, Daniel extended his gloved hand. "Take hold," he commanded, his voice cutting through the wind. The woman looked up, momentary relief washing over her face as she grasped his arm with surprising strength. With practiced ease, Daniel swung her up behind him onto Thunder's back. "Hold tight around my waist," he instructed. "Keep your head down against my back. The ranch is 20 minutes in good weather. In this, longer." He felt her arms encircle him, her body trembling violently from cold. Thunder knew the way home better than any compass, and Daniel gave the horse his head, trusting the animal's instincts more than his own in these conditions. The journey back to Evergreen Ranch seemed endless, the storm intensifying with each passing minute. Daniel felt the woman's grip weakening and knew they were racing against time. When the warm lights of the ranch house finally appeared through the swirling snow, he allowed himself a small breath of relief. His ranch hands rushed out at his whistle, taking Thunder's reins as Daniel carefully lifted the half-conscious woman from the saddle. He carried her into the house, barking orders for hot water, blankets, and his medical kit. In the warm light of the ranch house, Daniel finally got a proper look at the woman he had rescued. Despite her bedraggled appearance, there was something unmistakably refined about her features. She wasn't young, perhaps early 30s, with intelligent eyes that, even clouded by exhaustion, assessed her surroundings with scientific precision. "Dr. Catherine Blake," she managed to say through chattering teeth as Daniel wrapped her in warm blankets. "University of Chicago. I was supposed to meet with Mr. Hawkins of Evergreen Ranch tomorrow, but the stagecoach got stranded." "You found him," Daniel replied, pouring a measure of whiskey and holding it to her lips. "I'm Daniel Hawkins. Drink this. Then we talk." Catherine Blake had come to Teton Valley with a purpose, one that would forever alter the course of Daniel's carefully ordered existence. But neither of them knew it yet, as the blizzard raged outside, sealing them together in that moment of chance encounter that felt, in retrospect, like the hand of fate itself. Daniel Hawkins had not always been a rancher. Before claiming his family's land in Wyoming territory, he had been a soldier, fighting for the Union in the bloodiest conflict America had ever seen. The Springfield Model 1873 mounted above his fireplace was more than decoration. It had been his constant companion through the horror of Gettysburg and beyond. After the war, he had returned to the land his grandfather had settled, determined to build something lasting from the ashes of national conflict. Evergreen Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of some of the most beautiful country God ever created. Nestled in a valley flanked by the majestic Teton Mountains, with pine forests, rolling meadows, and a river that ran clear and cold year-round. By 1880, Daniel had transformed his inheritance into one of the most respected cattle operations in the territory. His beef fetched premium prices as far away as Chicago, and his breeding stock was sought after throughout the West. But success had not come without cost. The Panic of 1873 had nearly ruined him, as it had countless others. Banks called in loans, cattle prices plummeted, and for 3 years Daniel had worked himself nearly to death just to keep the ranch afloat. He had survived by diversifying, adding sheep to his operation despite the sneers of traditional cattlemen, planting crops where the land allowed, and taking on contract work, breaking horses for the cavalry. Now, 12 years later, he was financially stable again, but the economic scars remained. Every decision was measured twice, every expenditure questioned. Daniel had built his empire with calloused hands and stubborn determination, and he guarded it like the treasure it was. But there was another reason Daniel clung so fiercely to Evergreen Ranch. In a drawer in his study, carefully preserved, lay the Hawkins family Bible, recording births, marriages, and deaths stretching back 4 generations. Daniel was the last entry, the last Hawkins. And unless something changed, the line would end with him. That night, after Catherine had retired to her cabin, Daniel sat alone in his study, the family Bible open before him. He traced the names inscribed in fading ink: Jonathan Hawkins, 1789–1856. William Hawkins, 1815 to 1877. 4 generations of men who had built something from nothing, each adding to the legacy that now rested entirely on his shoulders. He pulled open the drawer where he kept his father's pocket watch and the letter from the army surgeon, the paper now yellow with age, but the words unchanged. Regret to inform Bo, extensive pelvic trauma, unlikely to father children. Clinical language for the end of a bloodline. Daniel poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, remembering his father's pride when he'd returned from the war. The questions had started a few years later, gentle at first, then increasingly concerned as the years passed without a bride or heir. He had never shared the truth with his father. Let him believe his son was simply choosy, or perhaps devoted to the ranch above family. The disappointment in the old man's eyes had been painful enough without adding pity. Even James didn't know. His brother had started his own family with easy joy, sending photographs of children who would never carry the Hawkins name, who would never know Evergreen as their birthright. Daniel moved to the window, looking out at the land that had been his consolation and purpose. If he couldn't continue the family through blood, he would make certain the ranch itself stood as monument to the Hawkins legacy. Each improvement, each acre added, each innovation in breeding stock, all of it his attempt to justify being the end of the line. And now this woman had arrived, stirring up questions he'd long since buried, making him acutely aware of his solitude in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel for years. Enough, he muttered, closing the Bible firmly. There was a land dispute to focus on. Personal regrets were a luxury he couldn't afford with Hollister circling like a vulture. Yet as he climbed the stairs to bed, the echo of emptiness in the large house seemed louder than it had in years. Morning came with blinding brightness, the storm having blown itself out overnight, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. Catherine Blake awoke into the guest bedroom, momentarily disoriented before the events of the previous day came rushing back. She rose and dressed quickly in clothes that had been left for her, clearly belonging to a woman smaller than herself, perhaps a housekeeper. When she descended to the dining room, she found Daniel Hawkins already at the table, reviewing papers and making notes in a ledger. He stood when she entered, a gesture of ingrained courtesy that seemed at odds with his otherwise rugged appearance. "Dr. Blake, you're looking considerably more alive this morning." Catherine smiled, accepting the cup of coffee a housekeeper silently offered. "Thanks to you, Mr. Hawkins. I realize our meeting wasn't scheduled until today, but your timely intervention yesterday spared the American Wildlife Conservation Society the embarrassment of losing their lead researcher to poor weather planning. Daniel raised an eyebrow, studying her with new interest. The Conservation Society? Your letter mentioned research, but was rather vague on details. Catherine set down her cup, shifting into what Daniel would come to recognize as her professional demeanor. I'm here to study the reproductive patterns of the gray wolf population in the greater Yellowstone region. Your ranch borders some of the last territories where these animals roam in sustainable numbers. Daniel's expression hardened. Wolves kill cattle, Dr. Blake. Every rancher in this territory would thank the Lord to see the last of them. And yet you've never participated in the bounty hunts? Catherine countered smoothly. Your neighbors have collected substantial payments for wolf pelts, but Evergreen Ranch is notably absent from those records. The observation caught Daniel off guard. Few people had noticed his quiet abstention from the territory's enthusiastic wolf eradication efforts. I kill what threatens my herds directly, he said carefully, but I don't hunt for sport or bounty. My grandfather believed in balance. Take only what you need, leave the rest in nature's hands. Catherine nodded, seeming to file this information away. The Conservation Society is prepared to pay handsomely for access to your land for our studies. 6 months of observations, primarily in the northern sections where you run fewer cattle. My land isn't for rent, Blake, Daniel replied, standing and moving to the window. The morning sun glinted off the snow-covered mountains, creating a view that never failed to humble him. I appreciate the offer, but I have no interest in hosting a bunch of city scientists tramping around, disturbing my operations to study animals most folks around here shoot on sight. Catherine's voice remained level, but took on a new note of determination. It wouldn't be a bunch of scientists, Mr. Hawkins. It would be me, alone. I've been studying wolf populations for 7 years across 3 continents. I know how to move quietly and stay out of the way. Daniel turned, surprise evident on his face. A woman, alone, tracking wolves through mountain wilderness? That's not just unusual, Dr. Blake. That's dangerous. More dangerous than riding out alone in a blizzard? Catherine challenged, meeting his gaze directly. I may not have been prepared for yesterday's weather, but I assure you I'm fully qualified for my work. Their standoff was interrupted by a knock at the door. Daniel's foreman, Bill Cooper, entered with an apologetic nod to Catherine before addressing his employer. Sorry to interrupt, boss, but Franklin Hollister is here. Says he needs to speak with you urgent-like. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Show him in, Cooper. Catherine observed the subtle change in Daniel's demeanor with interest. Whoever this Hollister was, he clearly wasn't a welcome visitor. Franklin Hollister swept into the room with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention. In his mid-40s, he wore a suit finer than anything available in the territory, his watch chain gold, his boots polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him spoke of Eastern money and influence. Hawkins, he nodded curtly, then noticed Catherine. His expression shifted to practiced charm. I wasn't aware you had company. Franklin Hollister, at your service, ma'am. I own the Territorial Bank and several business interests in the region. Dr. Catherine Blake, she replied simply, noting how Hollister's eyebrows rose slightly at her title. Dr. Blake is a wildlife researcher, Daniel explained, making no move to offer Hollister a seat. What brings you to Evergreen, Franklin? I doubt it's social. Hollister smiled thinly. Direct as always. I've come with the news you should hear privately, but perhaps the doctor would excuse us? Dr. Blake is my guest, Daniel said firmly. Whatever you have to say can be said in her presence. Hollister shrugged elegantly. As you wish. The territorial tax assessor has completed his new valuations. With the railroad spur coming through, land values have increased substantially. Your property taxes have been reassessed accordingly. He removed a document from his breast pocket and placed it on the table. You'll find the new amount due by June 1st. Daniel picked up the paper, his expression unchanging as he read. Only someone watching closely, as Catherine was, would notice the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible tensing of his shoulders. This is nearly triple last year's assessment, Daniel said finally, his voice level. Hollister spread his hands in a gesture of mock helplessness. Progress comes at a cost, Hawkins. The railroad means prosperity for the whole territory. Surely a businessman like yourself understands that infrastructure requires funding. A businessman also understands when numbers are being manipulated, Franklin. Daniel set the paper down carefully. This reassessment targets certain properties while leaving others curiously untouched. Properties that coincidentally belong to your business associates. Hollister's smile never wavered. The assessor is an independent official. If you have concerns about his methods, there's an appeals process. Of course, that takes time, and the payment deadline remains the same. He turned to Catherine, switching topics with smooth precision. Dr. Blake, if you're conducting research in our territory, you must join us for dinner at my home. My fiancée, Rebecca Morgan, would be delighted to meet an accomplished female academic. Her father is Judge Morgan, who oversees most legal matters in these parts. The subtle emphasis on the judge's position wasn't lost on either of his listeners. Before Catherine could respond, Hollister continued. In fact, we're hosting a small gathering this Friday evening. Several territorial officials will be present, including those involved with land management and conservation. Your research might benefit from such connections. Catherine glanced at Daniel, noting the carefully controlled tension in his posture. Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Hollister. I'll consider it. Hollister nodded, satisfied, and turned back to Daniel. The railroad has changed everything, Hawkins. Those who adapt will prosper. Those who cling to the past. He let the implication hang in the air. Think about my offer. The bank is prepared to purchase Evergreen Ranch at a fair market price. With the tax burden increasing, it might be the sensible option. My ranch isn't for sale, Daniel stated flatly. Not to you, not to anyone. Everyone has a price, Hawkins. Hollister retrieved his hat from the rack by the door. Even you. Good day to you both. After Hollister's departure, silence filled the room. Catherine watched Daniel as he stood motionless, staring at the tax assessment. He wants your land very badly, she observed finally. Daniel looked up, something unreadable passing through his eyes. Hollister wants everything he doesn't already own. He came to the territory 10 years ago with Eastern banking connections and started buying up struggling ranches after the panic. Now he controls half the businesses in town and has the territorial government in his pocket. He folded the assessment paper carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. But he's right about one thing. The railroad is changing everything. Catherine saw an opening and seized it. Mr. Hawkins, I believe we might be able to help each other. Daniel raised an eyebrow, waiting. The Conservation Society's grant for my research is substantial. I need access to your land, and you need additional income to offset these new taxes. I propose a simple arrangement. I pay you a fair rental fee for access to the northern section of your property, and in return, I conduct my studies without interference. She watched him consider this, calculating the financial implications. Furthermore, she continued, documenting the ecological significance of this valley could potentially support a case against excessive development. Conservation designations can sometimes affect tax assessments. Daniel studied her with new interest. You catch on quick for someone who just arrived, Blake. Catherine, she corrected him. An observation is my profession, Mr. Hawkins. Daniel, he responded automatically, then walked to the window again, looking out at his land. The land his grandfather had claimed, his father had defended, and he had built into a legacy. $500 for 6 months, he said finally, turning back to face her. Access to the northern section only, and you follow my rules about where you can go and when. You'll need proper gear and training if you're going into those mountains alone. First sign of trouble with my operations, the arrangement ends. Catherine smiled, extending her hand. Agreed, and perhaps you might consider sharing your knowledge of the territory. Local expertise would be invaluable to my research. Daniel hesitated only briefly before shaking her hand, her grip firmer than he expected. Neither of them could have imagined how this simple business arrangement would eventually alter both their lives forever. The next 2 weeks established a routine at Evergreen Ranch. Catherine set up her research equipment in an unused cabin near the northern boundary, transforming the rustic space into a functional field laboratory. Daniel, true to his word, provided her with proper wilderness gear and basic training in mountain survival. Your city boots will get you killed up there, he told her bluntly on their first day, eyeing her footwear with disapproval. From a storage chest, he produced a pair of handcrafted leather boots. These belonged to my sister-in-law before she and my brother moved to California. Should fit you well enough. Catherine was surprised. I didn't realize you had family in California. A shadow crossed Daniel's face. My brother James was the only other Hawkins of our generation. He fought at Antietam, came home changed, couldn't settle back into ranch life. He and his wife moved west in '75. We write occasionally. She noted how he said the only other Hawkins, filing away this nugget of information with the growing collection of observations about her reluctant host. Daniel proved to be an excellent, if demanding, teacher. He showed Catherine how to read animal tracks, identify edible plants, navigate by stars, and handle the Winchester rifle he insisted she carry. Wolves aren't the only predators in these mountains, he explained, patiently correcting her stance as she aimed at a makeshift target. Mountain lions, bears, and occasionally two-legged threats require respect and preparation. Catherine was a quick study, though her first attempts at horseback riding left her sore and frustrated. Daniel watched with poorly concealed amusement as she grimaced, climbing stiffly into the saddle for their third day of training. The horse knows when you're nervous, he advised, leading her mount through basic maneuvers, confidence, and balance. The rest comes with practice. By the end of the second week, Catherine had progressed enough for Daniel to grudgingly approve her solo excursions to the northern pastures. She established observation posts near known wolf territories, meticulously documenting pack movements, hunting patterns, and social behaviors. What Daniel didn't know was that wolves weren't her only research interest. Catherine Blake had come to Wyoming with dual purposes, one stated in her Conservation Society grant, and another more personal scientific quest. The northern gray wolves were indeed her primary study, but their reproductive patterns held special significance beyond general conservation. In her field notes, she documented unusual cases where wolves once thought to be sterile had successfully produced offspring after years of apparent infertility. These observations paralleled research she'd been conducting with Dr. Elizabeth Bennett at the University of Chicago, research that challenged conventional medical understanding of certain types of infertility in mammals, including humans. Late one evening, as Catherine pored over her notes in the cabin laboratory, the door opened without warning. Daniel stood in the threshold, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the space transformed by scientific equipment. "You missed dinner," he said simply, placing a covered plate on the one clear corner of her work table. Mrs. Winters was concerned. Catherine straightened, suddenly aware of how late it had grown. "Please thank her for me. I lost track of time comparing these samples." Daniel nodded but made no move to leave. Instead, he stepped further into the cabin, examining the carefully labeled specimens and detailed drawings pinned to the walls. "You're not just studying population numbers," he observed, eyes narrowing as he read her notations on wolf reproductive cycles. Catherine hesitated, then decided on honesty. "My primary research is indeed wolf conservation, but I have a particular interest in reproductive biology, specifically cases where fertility returns after prolonged periods of apparent sterility." Daniel went very still, his attention fixing on a specific page of notes. Catherine followed his gaze and felt a chill. He was looking at her comparative notes on mammalian reproductive recovery after traumatic injury, notes that included observations about humans. "This goes beyond wolf conservation," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Catherine nodded slowly. "The Conservation Society funds my wolf research, but Dr. Bennett and I have been studying reproductive recovery across species for years. The implications for human medicine are potentially significant." Daniel turned to face her fully, something vulnerable briefly visible in his eyes before being quickly masked. "And what exactly brought you to my land, Dr. Blake? Was it truly the wolves, or was there another reason?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications Catherine couldn't fully decipher. Before she could formulate a response, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Daniel moved to the window with the fluid alertness of a man accustomed to potential threats. "3 riders," he reported, his posture tensing. "After dark, no lanterns. That's not a social call." He reached for the rifle mounted by the door. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me." Catherine watched from the window as Daniel strode toward the approaching riders, rifle held casually but ready. She recognized Franklin Hollister immediately, his fine coat gleaming in the moonlight. Beside him rode a younger woman, elegantly dressed even for an evening ride, presumably his fiancée. The third rider hung back in the shadows, his posture suggesting watchful alertness. Though too distant to hear the conversation, Catherine could read the increasing tension in Daniel's stance as the exchange progressed. When Hollister gestured emphatically toward the northern section of the property, her research area, Daniel's refusal was evident in his firm headshake. The standoff continued for several minutes before Hollister finally turned his horse, clearly dissatisfied. As the party departed, the third rider lingered momentarily, studying the ranch layout with calculating eyes before following his employer. Daniel returned to the cabin, his expression grim. When Catherine opened the door, he entered without preamble. Hollister claims the railroad survey team needs access to the northern section to complete their assessments. Wanted permission to bring them through tomorrow. But that's not what he really wants, Catherine guessed. No, he's fishing for information about your research. Seems very interested in why the Conservation Society chose my land specifically. Daniel set his rifle down, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. Also introduced his fiancée, Rebecca Morgan. Lovely woman, seems uncomfortable with her intended. He fixed Catherine with a penetrating look. Hollister doesn't make social calls after dark, and he doesn't personally escort survey requests. He wants something on my land, and I think your presence has made him nervous. Catherine considered this. The man with them? James Wilson, known as Rattlesnake, former bounty hunter turned Hollister's personal enforcer. Daniel's voice hardened. Not the kind of man who accompanies genteel evening rides without purpose. He moved to leave, then paused at the door. Lock up tonight, and tomorrow show me exactly where you've been conducting your observations. I need to know what Hollister might be after. The next morning dawned clear and cold, frost painting the landscape in crystalline white. Daniel and Catherine rode north, following the creek that marked the boundary between grazing lands and the wilder terrain where wolves sometimes denned. Catherine led him to her primary observation blind, a carefully constructed shelter overlooking a natural meadow where she had documented wolfpack activities. From her saddlebag, she produced detailed maps marked with wolf movement patterns, territorial boundaries, and suspected den locations. Daniel studied the maps with surprising expertise, occasionally nodding or asking insightful questions that revealed his own extensive knowledge of the land and its wildlife. The Maine pack has contracted its territory compared to when I was a boy, he observed, tracing the boundaries Catherine had marked. Used to range all the way to Miller's Creek, 10 miles east. Catherine nodded eagerly. Exactly. Human encroachment has reduced their range by nearly 40% in 2 decades. But what's fascinating is that despite the reduced territory, they've maintained breeding success. In fact, I've documented something remarkable. She withdrew her journal, opening to carefully detailed observations. This male wolf, I call him Scarred Eye, was injured 3 years ago in what appeared to be a territorial dispute. Local hunters reported he disappeared from the pack for months. When he returned, he seemed to have lost his breeding status. For 2 seasons, he produced no offspring despite attempts to mate. Daniel listened intently as she continued. This spring, however, he successfully sired a litter with the pack's alpha female. It challenges conventional understanding of reproductive recovery. Something in his physiology healed, despite the assumption of permanent damage. She watched Daniel carefully as she spoke, noting the subtle shift in his posture, the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Nature finds a way, he said finally, his voice distant. Things we think are permanent sometimes aren't. They rode in silence for a while, cresting a rise that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. Daniel reined his horse to a stop, gazing out over his land with an expression of mingled pride and concern. My grandfather claimed this land in 1837, he said quietly. Lived in a one-room cabin the first 10 years. My father expanded to the North Fork, built the main house. I've added the western section and improved every acre. He turned to Catherine, something vulnerable briefly visible beneath his stoic exterior. Hollister sees land as investment, numbers on a ledger. He doesn't understand that some things have value beyond money. Before Catherine could respond, Daniel abruptly changed course, spurring his horse toward a rocky outcropping to their right. There's something I need to show you. They dismounted at the base of the formation, tying their horses to a stunted pine. Daniel led the way up a narrow path that wound between weather-worn boulders. At the summit, a natural platform of flat rock offered an unobstructed view in all directions. Grandfather called this Eagle Point, Daniel explained, gesturing toward the expansive vista. You can see the entire northern border from here. Watch. He raised a hand, pointing to a distant ridge where movement caught Catherine's eye. Through her field glasses, she could make out men on horseback, accompanied by surveyors with equipment. Railroad survey team, Daniel confirmed grimly. But they're not on the approved route. They're mapping my northern border, well away from where the railroad spur is supposed to run. Catherine frowned. Why would they survey here unless they're planning something else? Daniel finished. Something Hollister doesn't want announced until he's secured the land. They watched as the survey team methodically worked their way along the ridge, taking measurements and making notes. Among them, Catherine recognized the figure of James Wilson, Hollister's enforcer, closely observing the proceedings. We need to find out what they're really looking for, Catherine said, lowering her glasses, and why Hollister is suddenly so determined to acquire your land specifically. Daniel nodded, his jaw set in determination, and why he's so interested in your research. I think it's time we accepted that dinner invitation and did some investigating of our own. As they descended from Eagle Point, neither noticed the lone figure watching them from the distant tree line. Rattlesnake Wilson, his spyglass trained on their every move, his expression calculating as he observed the growing camaraderie between the rancher and the scientist. That evening, as Catherine returned to her cabin after dinner at the main house, she found a folded note that had been slipped under her door. Opening it, she discovered elegant feminine handwriting. Dr. Blake, I must speak with you urgently regarding Franklin Hollister's interest in Evergreen Ranch. There are things you and Mr. Hawkins need to know. Meet me at Widow Jensen's millinery shop in town tomorrow at noon. Come alone and tell no one. Rebecca Morgan. Catherine stared at the note, pulse quickening. Rebecca Morgan, Hollister's fiancée, wanted a secret meeting. The potential for information was significant, but so was the risk. As she contemplated her next move, Catherine was unaware that miles away, in his elegant office, Franklin Hollister was examining a geological survey report that confirmed what he had suspected. Beneath the northern section of Evergreen Ranch lay one of the richest copper deposits in the territory, a fortune waiting to be claimed, if only he could get Daniel Hawkins out of the way. And James Rattlesnake Wilson was making his own plans. He had recognized something in the way Daniel Hawkins looked at Dr. Catherine Blake, something the rancher might not even acknowledge to himself yet. Wilson smiled coldly as he cleaned his revolver by lamplight. In his experience, a man's attachments were always his greatest vulnerability. The game was in motion, with forces converging on Evergreen Ranch from all directions. And at the center stood Daniel Hawkins, the last of his line, a man with more to lose than anyone realized, and perhaps more to gain than he had ever dared to hope. Catherine arrived at Widow Jensen's millinery shop with caution, scanning the street for any sign of Wilson or Hollister's other men before entering. The cheerful bell above the door contrasted with her tension. She found the shop empty of customers, with only the widow arranging hats near the window. She's waiting in back, the widow said quietly, nodding toward a door marked private. Seemed mighty nervous, that one. Rebecca Morgan paced the small room, looking more like a trapped bird than a privileged banker's fiancé. Her eyes darted to the door when Catherine entered, relief washing over her features. You weren't followed? Rebecca asked immediately, her voice barely above a whisper. I took precautions, Catherine assured her, studying the younger woman. Though dressed in expensive clothes, Rebecca had a drawn quality that spoke of sleepless nights. Your note suggested urgency. Rebecca gestured to a chair, closing the door firmly before taking a seat herself. What I'm about to share would destroy me socially and financially if Franklin discovered it, she said, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. But I can't be party to what he's planning. Not anymore. She removed a folded document from her reticule. 3 months ago, a geological survey team discovered copper deposits in the northern section of Teton Valley. Most of the copper lies beneath Evergreen Ranch. She slid the paper across the table. This is a copy of their confidential report to Franklin. Catherine unfolded the document, scanning the technical analysis and accompanying maps. This shows an extensive deposit, potentially worth millions, Rebecca finished. Franklin has been buying land throughout the territory for years, but this discovery changed everything. He's now obsessed with acquiring Evergreen specifically. Catherine frowned, connecting pieces of information. The tax reassessment. Rebecca nodded. The first step in forcing Mr. Hawkins to sell. The assessor is Franklin's cousin by marriage. Why are you telling me this? Catherine asked directly. Rebecca's composure briefly faltered, revealing genuine distress. I was raised to believe in honesty and fair dealing. My father may be leveraged by Franklin's financial influence, but he taught me better than this. She hesitated, twisting the engagement ring on her finger. And I've seen what Franklin is capable of when opposed. He doesn't merely defeat rivals, Dr. Blake. He destroys them. The young woman leaned forward, lowering her voice. Your presence at Evergreen has complicated Franklin's plans. He can't make certain moves while an outside observer from the Conservation Society is present. That's why he invited you to dinner Friday night. To assess whether I could be bought or intimidated, Catherine concluded. Precisely, and to separate you from Mr. Hawkins long enough for his man Wilson to search your research cabin. Catherine felt a chill run through her. They want to know what I've discovered. Franklin believes your research might be related to the copper deposits. He's paranoid that the Conservation Society somehow learned about the discovery and sent you to interfere. Catherine considered this new information carefully. Mr. Hawkins needs to know about the copper. Yes, Rebecca agreed, but you must be careful how you tell him. Franklin has eyes everywhere, including some of the ranch hands at Evergreen. Why are you helping us? Catherine asked directly. You're engaged to the man. Rebecca's smile held no warmth. A business arrangement, not a love match. My father owes Franklin substantial sums. My hand in marriage was part of the settlement. She twisted her engagement ring again. I've accepted my fate, but I won't be complicit in the destruction of a good man's legacy through corrupt means. The bell at the front of the shop jingled, and both women tensed. Widow Jensen's voice carried from the main room, greeting a male customer inquiring about hat repairs. That's Wilson, Rebecca whispered urgently, recognizing the voice. He must have followed you. I must go out the back way. She gathered her things quickly. Be careful, Dr. Blake. Wilson isn't just Franklin's enforcer. He's a true believer in Franklin's vision for the territory, and he's dangerous. He once killed a man for standing in the way of a land deal. Catherine nodded, her mind racing. What will you do? Return to my role as the dutiful fiancé, Rebecca replied with resignation. But I'll help where I can. She paused at the back door. There's one more thing you should know. Franklin has arranged for Judge Morgan to be away on circuit for the next month. Without my father's moderate influence, Franklin will be even bolder in his actions. With those final words, Rebecca slipped away, leaving Catherine alone with explosive information and difficult decisions. Catherine waited several minutes, listening to Wilson's conversation with the widow. He was clearly fishing for information, asking seemingly casual questions about who frequented the shop. When he finally departed, Catherine emerged from the back room with a convincing story about ordering a special sun hat for her fieldwork. The ride back to Evergreen gave her time to consider how best to approach Daniel with what she'd learned. The revelation about copper deposits explained Hollister's sudden intense interest, but it also dramatically raised the stakes of their situation. She found Daniel in the training corral, working with a spirited young horse. Catherine paused to watch, admiring the patient skill with which he communicated with the animal. There was a quietness to his strength that she found increasingly compelling. Daniel noticed her presence and handed the training reins to a young ranch hand. He approached the fence where Catherine waited, his expression shifting as he read concern in her face. Something's happened, he stated rather than asked. Catherine nodded. Is there somewhere we can speak privately? They walked to the stream that ran behind the main house, following it to a small clearing shielded by cottonwood trees. The rushing water would mask their conversation from any potential eavesdroppers. I met with Rebecca Morgan, Catherine began without preamble, then recounted everything she had learned about the copper deposits, the manipulated tax assessment, and Hollister's plans. Daniel listened without interruption, his face betraying little emotion beyond a tightening around his eyes. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment, gazing at the stream as it wound through his property. Copper, he finally said, the word heavy with implication. That explains much. My grandfather used to talk about odd-colored rocks in the North Creek bed. We always thought they were just minerals with no particular value. According to the survey, it's a significant deposit, Catherine confirmed, potentially one of the largest in the territory. Daniel picked up a stone and turned it thoughtfully in his hands. My land has always given me what I needed. Seems it was hiding more than I knew. He skipped the stone across the water with practiced ease. What I don't understand is why Hollister thinks your research has anything to do with copper. Catherine hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. Because it's unusual for the Conservation Society to fund a lone researcher in this region. He's suspicious of coincidences. And, she paused, choosing her words carefully, he may have intercepted correspondence between myself and Dr. Bennett in Chicago that mentioned samples and extraction. Which referred to your wolf research, Daniel concluded. Yes, but could be misinterpreted as geological interest. Daniel nodded slowly. Hollister sees threats everywhere because that's how he operates. Always looking for advantage, always suspicious. He turned to face Catherine directly. You realize this changes your position here. If Hollister believes you're interfering with his plans, you could be in danger. I considered leaving, Catherine admitted, but my research is important, and now I'm involved whether I wish to be or not. A ghost of a smile crossed Daniel's face. Stubborn, determined, she corrected, and concerned about what Hollister might do next. Rebecca warned that without Judge Morgan's moderating influence, he may become more aggressive. Daniel's expression hardened. Hollister's mistake is thinking I can be maneuvered like his business associates. This land isn't just property to me. He gestured to the surrounding countryside. Every acre holds memory. My father is buried on the South Ridge. My mother's favorite view was from the East Meadow. I took my first steps on the porch of the main house. Catherine was struck by the quiet passion in his voice. This was not mere sentiment, but bone-deep connection to place that defined his very identity. We need to proceed carefully, she said. Rebecca mentioned that Wilson plans to search my research cabin while I'm at dinner with Hollister Friday night. Then we give him something to find, Daniel replied, a strategic glint in his eye. Something that will misdirect Hollister's attention while we gather proof of his manipulation of the tax assessments. Catherine smiled slowly. I believe I can create some very convincing research notes that suggest my interest lies entirely with wolves, far from the northern section where the copper is located. Daniel nodded approvingly. Meanwhile, I'll contact my brother in California. James practiced law before moving west. He'll know how to formally challenge the tax assessment. As they walked back toward the main house, Catherine found herself studying Daniel's profile. The mountain man facade concealed a sharp, strategic mind and deeper complexities than she had initially perceived. And beneath his composed exterior, she sensed the weight of loneliness he carried as the last of his family line. That evening, as Catherine worked on creating misleading research notes in her cabin, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Through the window, she saw Daniel dismounting from Thunder, his expression grave. She opened the door before he could knock. What's happened? Daniel removed his hat as he entered. Samuel Hayes's place was hit last night. His storage barn burned to the ground. Catherine frowned. Samuel Hayes? Samuel Hayes, Daniel explained, his voice carrying tightly controlled anger, owns the ranch bordering ours to the east. Fought for the Union 9th Cavalry, Buffalo Soldiers they called them. Came west with nothing but his freedom papers and a mule in '67. Daniel's eyes grew distant with memory. During the blizzard of '79, when most neighbors barred their doors, Samuel rode out with me for 3 days straight. We saved nearly 2/3 of my herd when many lost everything. That man knows more about this land and its creatures than most who've lived here generations. Catherine noted the deep respect in Daniel's voice, unusual in these times when former slaves rarely received recognition for their achievements. His ranch isn't large, Daniel continued, but it's a model of efficiency. Uses techniques he learned from his grandfather, who was a master agriculturalist in Africa before being captured. Samuel's been teaching me about crop rotation patterns that work better in our soil than anything in the farming journals. He handed Catherine a daguerreotype showing a dignified black man in his 50s, standing proudly beside a fine Morgan horse. Intelligence and determination radiated from the man's steady gaze. Now he's lost nearly all his winter feedstock, Daniel concluded grimly. In a rainstorm, no less. Feed that doesn't just catch fire without help. Hollister? Catherine asked quietly. Daniel nodded grimly. Almost certainly Wilson's work, though nothing can be proven. Samuel says he saw riders leaving but couldn't identify them in the dark. Why target Hayes? Because he's my ally on the Territorial Ranchers Council. And because Hollister knows I'll help Samuel rebuild, stretching my resources thinner before the tax deadline. Daniel sighed, removing a folded paper from his pocket. There's more. This came by messenger this afternoon. Catherine took the document, scanning its official letterhead. A formal notice of railroad right-of-way across the northern section of Evergreen Ranch. She looked up sharply. But that's not where the planned route runs. They've adjusted the route, Daniel confirmed. Directly through the area with copper deposits. The new route requires clearing a stretch of forest where I believe your wolves have a den site. Catherine saw the implications immediately, giving them legal access to the copper and undermining my research simultaneously. Daniel nodded. They're moving more quickly than I anticipated. The right-of-way acquisition meeting is scheduled for next Wednesday with the Territorial Commissioner. That's the day after Hollister's dinner, Catherine noted. Precisely. He plans to announce it triumphantly at his gathering, presenting it as a done deal. Daniel's jaw tightened. But he's made a miscalculation. The right-of-way requires my signature unless they pursue formal condemnation proceedings, which take months. He expects you to sign under pressure, Catherine realized, or to create a situation where my refusal appears unreasonable and against territorial interests. Daniel moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening landscape. We need to change our approach. Defense won't be enough. We need to take the initiative. Catherine watched him, sensing a shift in his demeanor. The reserved rancher was giving way to the tactical soldier he had once been. I've invited Samuel Hayes to dinner tomorrow night, Daniel continued. His perspective may be valuable. As a former slave, he's developed unique insights into dealing with men who believe power gives them ownership rights over others. Catherine nodded, appreciating the wisdom in this. What about Rebecca's warning about Wilson searching my cabin during Hollister's dinner? We'll proceed with our misinformation plan, Daniel replied. But I've also arranged for my most trusted ranch hand, Cooper, to follow you to town and keep watch. If Wilson leaves the dinner to come here, Cooper will ride ahead to warn us. Their eyes met in the lamplight, a moment of silent understanding passing between them. They were no longer merely landlord and tenant, nor simply allies of convenience. Something deeper was forming, unspoken but increasingly evident. I've been honest about my wolf research, Daniel, but there's more to it, Catherine said, her voice softening. The Conservation Society isn't aware, but Dr. Bennett and I have been documenting a pattern across multiple mammalian species, instances of reproductive recovery after trauma previously thought permanent. Daniel grew perfectly still, his expression unchanged, but something flickering behind his eyes. Your medical history, the wound at Gettysburg, it's remarkably similar to cases we've studied, she continued, words carefully chosen. Modern medicine is challenging assumptions made by battlefield doctors with limited knowledge and equipment. What was diagnosed as permanent then might be incomplete now. Because you deserve to know there may be hope, Catherine answered simply. And because if we're facing Hollister together, you should understand my research fully. It's not just about wolves, it's about challenging medical assumptions that have profound impacts on human lives. Daniel placed his hat on the table and ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of vulnerability. For 15 years, I've accepted that the Hawkins line ends with me, built my life around that certainty. He looked at her, something raw and questioning in his gaze. Are you saying that might not be true? I'm saying it's worth investigating, Catherine replied carefully. If you want to know for certain, Dr. Bennett could conduct proper examinations when we're next in Chicago. The implication of a future journey together hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging it directly. I'll consider it, Daniel said finally, his composure returning. He retrieved his hat and moved toward the door. Rest well, Catherine. Tomorrow we begin our countermove. After he left, Catherine remained standing in the center of her cabin, aware that something fundamental had shifted. She had come to Wyoming to study wolves and perhaps advance her theories on reproductive recovery. Now she found herself embroiled in a land battle with a powerful enemy, while developing feelings for a man who represented everything she hadn't known she wanted. The next evening brought Samuel Hayes to Evergreen Ranch for dinner. The setting sun cast long shadows as he rode in on a chestnut mare, his posture upright despite his 60-plus years, a dignity earned through a lifetime of refusing to be broken. "Daniel Hawkins," he called out, dismounting with the ease of a much younger man. "Seems trouble follows you like flies on cattle." Daniel embraced the older man warmly. "Samuel, appreciate you coming." Hayes removed his hat, revealing silver hair cropped close to his scalp. Deep lines etched his dark face, but his eyes held a sharp intelligence and hard-won wisdom. He wore simple clothes of good quality, the outfit of a man who valued substance over appearance. "Dr. Blake," Daniel said, "this is Samuel Hayes, finest horseman in the territory, best neighbor a man could ask for, and the only person who told me the truth when I needed to hear it after the war." Samuel extended a calloused hand to Catherine. "Ma'am, heard good things about your work." His handshake was firm, his gaze direct and assessing. Catherine immediately sensed there was nothing superficial about this man. "Mr. Hayes," she replied with genuine respect, "Daniel speaks highly of you." "Samuel, please," he corrected. "Mr. Hayes was my former master's name. Took my freedom but left that behind." As they moved toward the house, Catherine noted the easy camaraderie between the two men, something deeper than friendship, a brotherhood forged through shared hardship. Over dinner, Samuel's story emerged in fragments. Born into slavery in Georgia, he had escaped during the chaos of Sherman's march, fought alongside the Union Army as a scout, and eventually made his way west with nothing but determination and vision. "Land doesn't care who works it," he said, his deep voice carrying the measured cadence of a natural storyteller. "Doesn't care about the color of your hands, just that they're willing to work." Found freedom in that. He had built his ranch from nothing, facing down not just the elements, but also the prejudices of neighbors who resented a former slave-owning prime grazing land. "Lost near 30 bales of hay in that fire," he continued, his calm demeanor belying the severity of the attack. "Winter feed for 20 head of cattle at least. Mighty strange how that blaze started in the middle of a rainstorm." "Hollister," Daniel stated flatly. Samuel nodded, a slight tightening around his eyes the only indication of anger. "Man never dirties his own hands. But Wilson left tracks, found distinctive horseshoe prints by the creek behind my property." Catherine leaned forward. "Have you had previous encounters with Hollister, Samuel?" The older man's laugh held no humor. "Started 6 months back, came to my place dressed like he was visiting the president, offered to buy my land for half its value. When I declined, suggested banking with him might improve my situation." His expression darkened briefly. "Seen enough plantation masters in my life to recognize the type. Just wearing different clothes now." Daniel filled Hayes' glass. "Samuel's been advising me on territorial politics since I returned from the war. Sees things others miss." Hayes acknowledged this with a modest nod. "When you spend your early life as property, you learn to read the intentions of those who view everything and everyone as something to own." He turned his attention to Catherine. "Hollister's interest in your research troubles me, Dr. Blake. The man doesn't care about wolves or conservation. If he's fixated on your work, there's calculation behind it. We believe he's discovered copper deposits on Evergreen Ranch," Catherine explained. "He suspects my presence is related." Hayes considered this, then addressed Daniel. "The tax reassessment makes sense now. Classic technique. When I was a boy, I watched the master force out neighboring small farmers through similar means." "What would you advise?" Daniel asked. Hayes thought for a moment. "Hollister thrives in shadow, bring his actions into the light. The territorial governor is coming through next month for the railroad celebration. He fancies himself a reformer. Evidence of corruption in the tax assessor's office would interest him considerably." "That would require proof," Catherine noted. "Indeed," Hayes agreed. "Encourage from those inside Hollister's circle who might testify." He gave them a meaningful look, like a certain fiancée who seems increasingly uncomfortable with her future husband's methods. Daniel's eyebrows rose. "Rebecca Morgan?" "Judge's daughter has been asking questions about Hollister's land acquisitions," Hayes confirmed. "Visited my place last month, ostensibly about purchasing eggs, but asked very specific questions about my interactions with Hollister." Catherine exchanged glances with Daniel. "She's already approached me," she admitted. provided information about the copper deposits. Hayes nodded, unsurprised. She's trapped, but not willing to be used. Such allies are valuable, though vulnerable. He set down his fork, expression growing serious. But understand this. If you challenge Hollister directly, he will escalate beyond legal maneuvering. The barn fire is just the beginning. The gravity of Hayes's warning settled over the table. For several moments, they ate in thoughtful silence. There's something else you should know, Daniel said finally. The foreman at the Carson place saw strangers riding the northern border of my property yesterday. Not railroad surveyors, men with rifles who seemed to be assessing access points. Hayes frowned. Preparation for something more direct than legal pressure. We need to be ready, Daniel agreed. I've asked Cooper to organize additional night patrols. Catherine studied both men, sensing there was more they weren't saying. You believe Hollister might attempt to take the property by force? Not openly, Hayes replied, but a fire that destroys your records and coincidentally burns the main house? Cattle mysteriously stampeded through critical fences? These things happen with convenient timing when men like Hollister are involved. The reality of their situation crystallized for Catherine in that moment. This wasn't merely an economic or legal battle. Lives could be at stake, including theirs. As if reading her thoughts, Daniel spoke directly to her. Catherine, there would be no shame in returning to Chicago. Your research can resume when this situation is resolved. She straightened, meeting his gaze directly. I didn't survive 7 years in male-dominated academia by retreating from intimidation, Mr. Hawkins. I won't start now. A rare smile briefly transformed Daniel's serious features. Didn't think so, just had to offer. Hayes chuckled softly. Reminds me of my Josephine. God rest her soul. Braver than any man I ever knew. The conversation shifted to practical matters. They discussed security arrangements for the ranch, the misleading research notes Catherine would leave for Wilson to find, and how to gather evidence of Hollister's tax manipulation. As the evening concluded, Hayes prepared to leave, mounting his horse with the ease of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. Before departing, he addressed them both. My people have a saying, the tree that bends in the storm stands longest. Hollister expects direct confrontation. Consider approaching from directions he doesn't anticipate. With that cryptic advice, the older man tipped his hat and rode into the gathering darkness. After Hayes departed, Daniel and Catherine walked slowly back toward the main house. The night was clear, stars blazing in the velvet sky with an intensity only found far from city lights. Samuel survived slavery, war, and 30 years on the frontier, Daniel said quietly. I value his wisdom above most men's certainty. Catherine nodded. His suggestion about approaching from unexpected directions has merit. Hollister anticipates resistance about the tax assessment and right-of-way. What if we appeared to concede on those fronts while mounting a different challenge? Daniel considered this. Misdirection. Let him believe he's winning the battle he expects while we fight on ground of our choosing. He looked at her with new appreciation. What did you have in mind? I need to send telegrams to the Conservation Society and Dr. Bennett tomorrow, Catherine replied. With their support, we might be able to initiate an emergency conservation survey of the northern section, citing the wolf den sites as ecologically significant, which could delay the railroad right-of-way proceedings. Daniel followed her reasoning, but Hollister would fight that immediately. Yes, but while he's focused on discrediting the conservation angle, you could quietly gather evidence about the tax manipulation. Catherine's eyes gleamed with strategic intelligence. And I could request that Dr. Bennett travel here to assist with the survey, bringing her considerable scientific reputation to bear. They had reached the porch of the main house. Daniel stopped, turning to face her in the soft glow of the lamp hanging beside the door. You're risking your professional reputation by entangling your research with my land dispute, he observed. Catherine met his gaze steadily. Science doesn't exist in a vacuum, Daniel. The best research serves human needs and supports justice. If my work can help preserve this land from exploitation, that aligns perfectly with the Conservation Society's mission. Daniel studied her face in the lamplight. You're an unexpected ally, Catherine Blake. As are you, she replied softly. When I came here, I expected a suspicious, provincial rancher who would barely tolerate my presence. Instead, you got a stubborn, battle-scarred recluse, he said with a hint of self-deprecating humor. I got a man of principle, Catherine corrected him, and surprising depth. Something shifted in Daniel's expression, a momentary vulnerability quickly masked. We should finalize our plans for Hollister's dinner. It's the day after tomorrow. Catherine recognized his retreat to safer conversational ground, but didn't press. Yes, I've prepared the misleading research notes for Wilson to find. I'll attend the dinner and keep Hollister and his associates occupied while you meet with the county clerk about the tax records. Daniel nodded. Cooper will follow at a distance to ensure your safety. If anything seems amiss, he'll intervene. And afterward, Catherine asked, we'll meet at Hayes' ranch at 10 o'clock. If all goes well, I'll have documented evidence of the improper tax assessment by then. Their planning complete, an awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken awareness of the growing connection neither was ready to acknowledge fully. Good night, Mr. Hawkins, Catherine said finally, deliberately returning to formality. Daniel inclined his head slightly. To Blake. As Catherine walked back to her cabin, she was acutely conscious of Daniel watching until she was safely inside. The simple protective gesture affected her more deeply than she cared to admit. The next day passed in careful preparation. Catherine visited town to send telegrams to Chicago and the Conservation Society headquarters in New York. Daniel rode to the county seat, ostensibly to discuss water rights, but actually to reconnect with an old Army comrade who now worked as a clerk in the assessor's office. By evening, Catherine had received a promising reply from Dr. Bennett, who expressed both professional interest in the wolf research and personal concern for Catherine's situation. She agreed to travel to Wyoming within the week if needed. As Catherine prepared for bed, a soft knock at her cabin door startled her. Hand moving instinctively toward the Winchester rifle Daniel had insisted she keep nearby, she approached cautiously. Who's there? It's Daniel. She opened the door to find him standing in the darkness, his expression troubled. What's wrong? Ryder just came from town. There's been a development. He handed her a telegram. This arrived for you after you left the telegraph office. Catherine read the message with growing concern. Conservation Society board member Wallace, arriving tomorrow, stop. Instructed to evaluate your research progress. Stop essential meeting. Stop arriving noon trains. Stop. She looked up at Daniel. This makes no sense. The society never mentioned sending an evaluator, and certainly wouldn't do so without proper notice. Could it be legitimate? Daniel asked. Perhaps in response to your telegram today? Catherine shook her head. Impossible. Even if they dispatched someone immediately after receiving my message, they couldn't possibly arrive tomorrow. The timing is wrong. Hollister, Daniel concluded grimly. A trap, Catherine agreed. Someone claiming to be from the Conservation Society, probably to discredit my research or create a pretext for ending it. Daniel's jaw tightened. This changes our plans for tomorrow. You can't attend Hollister's dinner if this false evaluator is arriving. No, Catherine said firmly, that's exactly what Hollister wants. If I miss the dinner to meet this supposed Wallace, it confirms I've accepted the legitimacy of the telegram. We need to proceed as planned. And leave this unanswered? Not at all. Catherine's mind worked rapidly. We'll send Cooper to meet the noon train. He can explain that I've been unavoidably detained at Hollister's dinner and escort Wallace to the ranch for a meeting tomorrow morning. Exposing the imposter, Daniel nodded slowly. While proceeding with our original plan, Catherine confirmed, Hollister expects this telegram to disrupt our movements. Let's disappoint him. Daniel studied her with what might have been admiration. You'd have made a fine cavalry officer, Dr. Blake, always riding toward the sound of gunfire. She smiled slightly. In science, as in battle, sometimes the direct approach is best. Now we should both rest. Tomorrow will test us significantly. Daniel lingered a moment longer. Catherine, he said, his voice softer than usual. Be careful at Hollister's. Wilson won't be the only danger present. The concern in his voice warmed her despite the seriousness of their situation. I will. You do the same at the county offices. Hollister's influence runs deep. After Daniel left, Catherine reviewed the misleading research notes she'd prepared one final time. Everything was in place for their counteroffensive against Hollister. Yet as she finally drifted towards sleep, her thoughts were not of strategy or danger, but of Daniel Hawkins, the unexpected ally who was becoming something far more significant in her life. The day of Hollister's dinner dawned bright and clear. Catherine spent the morning completing genuine research observations, determined that her actual work wouldn't suffer despite the complications. Daniel rode out early to check on Samuel Hayes before continuing to the county seat. By late afternoon, Catherine was preparing for the dinner, donning the one formal dress she had brought to Wyoming. As she fastened her mother's cameo at her throat, she heard hoofbeats approaching rapidly. Moving to the window, she saw Cooper dismounting from a lathered horse. She opened the door before he could knock. "What's happened?" Cooper removed his hat, concern evident on his weathered face. "Mr. Hawkins sent me, ma'am. There's trouble. The county clerk who was going to help him access the tax records was found beaten this morning. Bad. Won't be helping anyone for a while." Catherine thought quickly, weighing their options. "Did you meet the train? Was there a Mr. Wallace?" Cooper nodded. "That's the other thing. Man claiming to be Wallace did arrive. I told him you'd meet him tomorrow as planned. He's staying at the hotel in town." "Did he seem legitimate?" "Can't say, ma'am. Dressed proper enough. Asked the right sort of questions about your research. But something felt off." Cooper frowned. "Knew a lot about the ranch layout for someone who's never been here." Catherine made her decision. "Please tell Mr. Hawkins I'll proceed as planned. We need to maintain our strategy. But add that I'll bring something special back from dinner that might help with his research at the county offices." Cooper looked puzzled but nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Anything else?" "Just be vigilant tonight. I suspect Hollister has multiple moves planned." After Cooper departed, Catherine made final preparations, including secreting a small notebook and pencil in her reticule. If she was going into the lion's den, she intended to gather whatever intelligence she could. As the sun began its descent behind the Teton Mountains, a carriage arrived to transport Catherine to Hollister's estate. The driver was none other than James Rattlesnake Wilson, his cold eyes assessing her as he helped her into the vehicle. "Dr. Blake," he acknowledged with a thin smile that never reached his eyes, "Mr. Hollister is looking forward to your company this evening." Catherine settled into the carriage, acutely aware that the dangerous game they were playing had reached a critical juncture. Wilson took his place on the driver's seat, and the carriage lurched forward, carrying her toward a gathering where she would be the only true ally among enemies. The Hollister estate stood as a monument to new money and Eastern pretension, its grand columns and manicured lawns jarringly out of place in the rugged Wyoming landscape. Catherine noted armed men positioned discreetly around the property as Wilson helped her from the carriage. Hollister was taking no chances tonight. "Welcome to Willow Creek Manor," Wilson said with forced courtesy. "Mr. Hollister is expecting you." Catherine ascended the marble steps, mentally cataloging every detail of the estate's defenses. Rebecca had warned her Hollister was becoming more paranoid. The armed guards confirmed it. The evening's performance would require perfect composure. Hollister smiled thinly. "Indeed. Please allow me to introduce you to our other guests." He led her into an opulent drawing room where a dozen of the territory's most influential citizens were gathered. Catherine recognized the mayor, the railroad commissioner, and several prominent businessmen, all men who benefited from Hollister's economic ventures. Their wives formed a separate cluster, examining Catherine with the wary curiosity reserved for unusual specimens. Rebecca Morgan stood slightly apart, elegant in blue silk that accentuated her youth and beauty. When their eyes met, Rebecca gave an almost imperceptible nod before gliding forward. "Dr. Blake, how wonderful to finally meet you properly," she said, taking Catherine's hands with genuine warmth that belied their supposed first meeting. "I've heard so much about your research. You must tell me about your wolves during dinner." "I'd be delighted," Catherine replied, grateful for the unexpected ally in this nest of adversaries. Hollister watched their interaction with calculated interest. "Rebecca has developed a surprising fascination with natural history lately. Perhaps your influence extends beyond Evergreen Ranch, Dr. Blake." The subtle warning in his tone was unmistakable. Catherine smiled pleasantly while making a mental note that Hollister suspected communication between herself and Rebecca. Dinner was an elaborate affair served in a dining room designed to impress. Crystal glittered under the light of an imported chandelier. Silver gleamed on damask tablecloths, and liveried servants attended to every need with practiced efficiency. Throughout the meal, Catherine maintained her role as the visiting academic, answering questions about her research with carefully crafted responses that revealed nothing of importance. As the main course was cleared, Hollister tapped his crystal glass, commanding attention. Friends, I've gathered you tonight not merely for the pleasure of your company, but to share exciting news. Tomorrow, the Territorial Railroad Commission will announce a significant rerouting of the Northern Spur Line. Murmurs of interest rippled around the table. Catherine kept her expression neutral, though she noted Rebecca's knuckles whitening around her fork. The new route will bring prosperity to our region far sooner than anticipated, Hollister continued. Construction will begin within the month, creating ways and opportunities for everyone in this room. His gaze lingered meaningfully on the businessmen present, all of whom would profit handsomely from railroad contracts. The railroad commissioner, a portly man named Thompson, nodded enthusiastically, a visionary adjustment to the original plan. The new route is far more efficient. And conveniently crosses Evergreen Ranch, Catherine observed mildly. Mr. Hawkins must be pleased with this development. A momentary silence fell over the table. Hollister recovered quickly, his smile never faltering. Mr. Hawkins will recognize the benefits to the entire territory. Progress requires certain sacrifices from all of us, especially those sitting on valuable resources, Catherine added, watching Hollister carefully. His eyes narrowed slightly. I'm not sure I follow your meaning, Derbyke. Merely an observation from my conservation work, she replied smoothly. Some lands hold greater value than is immediately apparent to the casual observer. Hollister studied her with new intensity. Indeed, perhaps you'd share more about your specific observations after dinner. I'm particularly interested in your work in the northern section of the ranch. Happily, Catherine agreed, aware she was being tested. The conversation shifted to territorial politics, with the mayor expounding on development plans that would clearly benefit Hollister's interests. Catherine noted each connection, each indication of Hollister's web of influence, mentally documenting information that might prove useful. As dessert was served, she observed Wilson slipping quietly from the room. Their plan was working. He was headed to search her research cabin while she remained occupied at the dinner. You seem distracted, Derbyke, Hollister remarked from beside her. Is the company not to your liking? On the contrary, Catherine replied. I was just thinking about a promising set of observations I recorded yesterday. Wolf behavior is particularly fascinating during the early summer months. More fascinating than railroad development? He asked with barely concealed sarcasm. Nature and progress need not be adversaries, Mr. Hollister. Catherine met his gaze directly. With proper management, both can thrive. That's what the Conservation Society advocates. Admirable sentiments, Hollister conceded, though sometimes difficult to implement when significant economic interests are at stake. He leaned slightly closer. Tell me, Derbyke, how much longer do you anticipate your research requiring access to Evergreen Ranch? The question carried clear implications. Catherine maintained her composed expression. Science is rarely constrained by convenient timetables, Mr. Hollister. My current grant extends through the fall, with potential for renewal based on preliminary findings. Something hardened in Hollister's eyes. Grants can be redirected. The Conservation Society has many influential donors, myself among them. How fortunate for conservation efforts, Catherine replied, refusing to be intimidated. Though scientific integrity requires that funding never influence research outcomes. Hollister's retort was interrupted by Rebecca, who approached with calculated timing. Father always says the same about judicial proceedings, doesn't he, Franklin? That financial considerations must never sway justice. Catherine didn't miss the flash of irritation that crossed Hollister's face before his polished veneer returned. Judge Morgan is a man of principle, he agreed smoothly. Speaking of which, I received a telegram this morning. He's concluding his circuit early and should return within the week. Rebecca's momentary tension was visible only to Catherine's watchful eye. Wonderful news. Father dislikes being away during important territorial developments. After dinner, the party separated by gender according to custom. The men retired to Hollister's study for cigars and brandy, while the women gathered in the drawing room. Catherine seized the opportunity to observe the portraits and documents adorning the walls, noting with interest a framed map showing extensive land holdings throughout the territory, with Evergreen Ranch prominently outlined in red. He's quite methodical in his acquisitions. Rebecca's voice came softly from beside her. Each property carefully selected for resources or strategic location. Catherine glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, The other women were engaged in gossip about an upcoming social event. "Your father returns earlier than expected," Catherine murmured. Rebecca nodded slightly. "Franklin's doing. He's not pleased with my recent independence. Father's presence is meant to remind me of my obligations." She hesitated, then added even more quietly, "The county clerk who was attacked. He's my father's cousin." The message was intended for multiple recipients. Before Catherine could respond, the drawing room doors opened and the men returned. Hollister approached immediately, his manner suggesting the brandy had loosened his calculated restraint. "Dr. Blake, I've been discussing your research with Commissioner Thompson. He raises an interesting point about the potential impact of the railroad construction on your wolf studies." Catherine recognized the beginning of a trap. Any significant environmental change affects wildlife patterns. That's precisely why documentation before such changes is valuable. Hollister smiled coldly. "Indeed. However, the commissioner wonders if perhaps your research might be more productively conducted in a less developing area. The territorial government owns several parcels further north that might suit your purposes." "A generous suggestion," Catherine replied carefully, "though my current arrangement with Mr. Hawkins is quite satisfactory." "Arrangements can change," Hollister pressed, "particularly when mutual benefit is considered. The railroad will require Mr. Hawkins' cooperation regardless of personal preferences." Catherine maintained her composed expression. "Mr. Hawkins seems quite capable of determining his own interests. As am I." Hollister's response was interrupted by a commotion at the front of the house. Moments later, Wilson entered, his usual controlled demeanor noticeably disturbed. He moved directly to Hollister, whispering urgently in his ear. Catherine observed the exchange with concealed interest, noting how Hollister's expression shifted from annoyance to sharp concern. When Wilson finished his report, Hollister glanced at Catherine with new calculation in his eyes. "It seems we have an unexpected development," he announced, his voice carrying forced pleasantry. "Dr. Blake, your colleague from the Conservation Society, Mr. Wallace, has arrived in town and is asking for you rather urgently. Wilson will escort you to meet him immediately." It was a command disguised as courtesy. Catherine recognized that whatever Wilson had discovered in her cabin had altered Hollister's plans. "How thoughtful," she replied, gathering her reticule. "Though I had arranged to meet Mr. Wallace tomorrow morning." "Science waits for no one," Hollister insisted with a tight smile. "And we wouldn't want to impede your important work." Catherine bid farewell to the assembled guests, exchanging a meaningful glance with Rebecca as she departed. Outside, Wilson held the carriage door with barely concealed tension. "Your conservation friend seems quite anxious to see you," he remarked as they pulled away from the estate. "Traveled all this way on short notice. Must be important." Catherine studied the enforcer's profile in the moonlight. "The society takes its research very seriously, Mr. Wilson, as do I. Your research notes were quite revealing, Dr. Blake," Wilson said as they traveled away from town. His casual tone couldn't mask the triumph underneath. "Surprised to see your primary study area is nowhere near the northern section." "The wolves determine my research locations, Mr. Wilson, not arbitrary human boundaries," Catherine replied, noting with growing concern that they were heading toward Teton Creek, not town as promised. Wilson's lips curved into a cold smile. "Convenient how those wolves led you far from where certain mineral interests might be found. Almost as if someone planned it that way." The carriage slowed as they approached a small clearing beside the creek. Catherine tensed, her hand moving subtly toward the small Derringer pistol Daniel had insisted she carry in her reticule. "Odd place to meet your colleague," she observed, making no move to exit the carriage. Wilson turned to face her, his pretense of civility evaporating. "There's no Wallace, Dr. Blake. Not here, not in town. Just a telegram to see how you'd react. And now we're going to have an honest conversation about what you're really doing at Evergreen Ranch." Catherine maintained her calm exterior despite her racing heart. "I believe I've been transparent about my research, Mr. Wilson." "Transparent as mud," Wilson snorted. "Conservation Society sending a lone woman researcher to this particular ranch, just when certain interests are developing? That's a coincidence that doesn't sit right." "Science often follows its own timing," Catherine replied, scanning the area for any sign of Cooper, who was supposed to be following at a distance. There was no indication of his presence. Wilson stepped down from the driver's seat and opened the carriage door. "Step out, Dr. Blake. Mr. Hollister wants certainty about your intentions, and I'm going to provide it." Catherine knew refusing would only escalate the situation. She descended from the carriage, maintaining distance between herself and Wilson. The clearing was silent except for the gentle gurgling of the creek and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. "Your notes mention reproductive studies," Wilson said, circling her slowly. "Breeding patterns of wolves, mighty specific interest, almost like you're looking for something particular." "All science begins with specific questions," Catherine replied, continuing to scan the surroundings. The moonlight cast long shadows among the trees, any of which might conceal help or additional threats. "Here's what I think," Wilson continued, his voice hardening. "I think you and Hawkins are working together on more than wolf research. I think you know about what's under his land, and I think you're both going to be disappointed when the Railroad Commission grants right-of-way tomorrow, regardless of what evidence he thinks he's gathering in town tonight." Catherine caught the implication immediately. "You seem very confident about tomorrow's decision." Wilson smiled coldly. "Money talks in this territory, Dr. Blake. So do threats. The commissioner's son works for Hollister's bank. His daughter's engaged to Hollister's lawyer. Family creates powerful motivation." He stepped closer, his hand moving to rest on his holstered pistol. "Now you have two choices. Leave on tomorrow's train with a generous research stipend from Mr. Hollister, or stay and face unfortunate consequences when your laboratory suffers an accident similar to Hayes's barn." The threat was unmistakable. Catherine maintained her composure, though her mind raced through limited options. Then, from the darkness behind Wilson, a voice spoke. "I believe the lady has a third option, Wilson." Daniel Hawkins stepped into the clearing, rifle leveled at Wilson's chest. Behind him emerged Samuel Hayes and two of Daniel's ranch hands, all armed and positioned strategically around the clearing. Wilson's hand froze over his holstered weapon. "Hawkins," he spat, "this doesn't concern you." "Threatening my guest on my land?" Daniel replied, his voice deceptively calm. "That very much concerns me." Catherine moved carefully away from Wilson, relief washing through her at Daniel's unexpected appearance. "How did you find us?" "Cooper saw Wilson take the fork toward the creek and rode ahead to warn me," Daniel explained, his eyes never leaving Wilson. "Seems Hollister's dinner ended earlier than anticipated for you." Wilson's eyes darted between his opponents, calculating odds that were clearly unfavorable. "You're making a mistake, Hawkins. This won't stop what's coming tomorrow." "Perhaps not," Daniel acknowledged, "but it will stop what's happening right now." He gestured with his rifle. "Your pistol. 2 fingers. Place it on the ground." Wilson complied with barely contained fury. Hayes moved forward to retrieve the weapon while Daniel continued. "Now you'll return to your employer with a message. Any further threats against Dr. Blake, myself, or my allies will be met with immediate consequences. Not frontier justice, though that's tempting, but full legal disclosure of everything we've learned about Hollister's manipulation of tax assessments and railroad commissions." Catherine watched Wilson's face, noting the flicker of uncertainty. "You're bluffing," the enforcer growled. "You found nothing in town tonight. The clerk was taken care of." "The clerk was," Daniel agreed, "but his wife wasn't. Seems she's been keeping duplicate records of her husband's work for years. Insurance, she called it. Very thorough woman, especially regarding certain properties receiving preferential tax treatment." Wilson's expression confirmed they'd struck a nerve. Daniel pressed his advantage. "Furthermore, the telegraph operator is an old friend from my regiment. He provided copies of some very interesting communications between Hollister and certain officials regarding copper deposits and railroad routes." "You have nothing," Wilson insisted, though with less conviction. "Enough to interest the territorial governor," Samuel Hayes interjected, "who, as it happens, is still looking to establish his reputation as a reformer before seeking federal office." Catherine stepped forward. "You can return to Mr. Hollister with this message. We know about the copper. We have evidence of the tax manipulation. And as of this morning, the Conservation Society has officially designated the northern section of Evergreen Ranch as critical habitat under study, requiring federal review before any development can proceed." This last claim was a calculated bluff. Catherine had requested such designation in her telegram, but confirmation couldn't possibly have arrived yet. Nevertheless, the possibility might give Hollister pause. Wilson's face twisted with suppressed rage. "This isn't over." "No," Daniel agreed coldly, "but tonight is. Get in the carriage and return to Hollister. Cooper will follow to ensure you reach your destination directly." After Wilson departed under the watchful eye of Cooper, Catherine finally allowed herself to relax slightly. That was fortuitous timing. Daniel's expression softened as he lowered his rifle. "Not entirely, Fortune. We've been watching Hollister's movements since discovering the attack on the clerk." He turned to Hayes. "Thank you, Samuel. Your men positioned at the crossroads were crucial." Hayes nodded. "Glad to help, though I suspect this is merely the first skirmish in a longer battle." "Indeed," Daniel agreed. "We should return to the ranch immediately. There's much to discuss before tomorrow's commission meeting." The ride back to Evergreen was tense but triumphant. Daniel explained that while the clerk had been attacked, his wife had indeed provided access to duplicate records clearly showing preferential treatment for Hollister's properties and punitive assessments for potential acquisition targets like Evergreen. "Not enough to bring charges yet," Daniel admitted, "but sufficient to raise questions with the governor's office." At the ranch, they gathered in Daniel's study, where he spread the documents across his desk. Catherine examined the evidence with growing satisfaction. "The pattern is unmistakable," she observed. "Properties Hollister acquired in the past 3 years all show reassessment drops after purchase. Those he's targeting show dramatic increases." "Classic manipulation," Hayes agreed, "but Hollister will claim these are legitimate market adjustments related to railroad development." "Which is why we need more," Daniel concluded. "The Railroad Commission meeting tomorrow is our opportunity to force these questions into the open." Catherine hesitated, then revealed her bluff regarding the conservation designation. "I've requested emergency habitat protection, but there's no way approval could have come so quickly." To her surprise, Daniel smiled. "Check the telegraph office first thing tomorrow. I sent a wire to my brother in California last week explaining our situation. His law firm represents several major conservation organizations. He may have expedited your request through channels we don't have access to." The realization that Daniel had been developing parallel strategies alongside their agreed plan impressed Catherine. The mountain man contained layers she was still discovering. "What about the supposed Conservation Society representative?" Hayes inquired. "A fraud, as we suspected," Daniel confirmed. "The real Conservation Society telegraphed this afternoon confirming they've sent no one." "Then who is this Wallace?" Catherine wondered. "Another of Hollister's men, most likely," Daniel replied. "Intended to discredit your research or create a pretext for removing you from Evergreen." They continued planning late into the night, developing contingencies for the commission meeting. When Hayes finally departed, Catherine remained, studying Daniel's determined profile as he reviewed documents once more. "You took a significant risk confronting Wilson tonight," she observed. Daniel looked up, his expression softening slightly. "No greater than you took attending Hollister's dinner alone." "We make a formidable team, it seems," Catherine said with a small smile. Something shifted in Daniel's gaze, a moment of unguarded emotion quickly contained. "We should both rest. Tomorrow we'll test everything we've prepared." Catherine nodded, rising to leave. At the door, she paused. "Daniel, regardless of tomorrow's outcome, I want you to know that my research here has become more than a professional obligation. I believe in preserving this land, not just for the wolves, but for what it represents." Daniel held her gaze. "And what does it represent, Dr. Blake?" "A balance between progress and preservation," she replied, "and a legacy worth defending." The weight of unspoken feelings hung between them as Catherine departed for her cabin. Both recognized that their alliance had evolved into something neither had anticipated, but there would be time to explore those implications after tomorrow's confrontation. Morning arrived with unexpected news. A telegram waited for Catherine at the ranch house, delivered by a breathless young rider who had come directly from town. "Emergency conservation designation approved. Stop federal review required before development. Stop letter following stop. Bennett arriving 3 days stop." Catherine read the message twice, scarcely believing their fortune. Daniel appeared behind her, freshly dressed for their appearance at the commission. "Good news?" he inquired, noting her expression. Wordlessly, she handed him the telegram. His eyes widened as he read. "James came through," he said with quiet satisfaction. "This changes Hollister's calculations significantly." Catherine nodded. The commission can still grant the right-of-way, but they can't authorize construction until the federal review is complete. That gives us time to build our case regarding the tax manipulation and Hollister's copper interests. Their momentary celebration was interrupted by Cooper, who arrived with urgent information. Riders approaching from town, looks like Commissioner Thompson and several others, including Wilson. Daniel and Catherine exchanged glances. They're coming here instead of waiting for the official meeting, Catherine observed. Hollister's changing tactics, Daniel agreed. Prepare to receive them, Cooper. We'll meet them at the main house. Within minutes, a group of 6 men arrived at Evergreen Ranch. Commissioner Thompson, visibly uncomfortable, led the contingent that included Wilson, the territorial surveyor, and 3 other officials. Mr. Hawkins, Thompson began formally, we've come to discuss the railroad right-of-way matter before the official hearing. Daniel stood on his porch, projecting calm authority. Unusual procedure, Commissioner. I was preparing to attend the scheduled hearing in town. Thompson shifted awkwardly. Circumstances have changed. We've received information that necessitates immediate action. What information would that be? Catherine inquired, stepping forward to stand beside Daniel. Wilson's cold gaze fixed on her. Federal conservation designation. Quite a coincidence in its timing. The Conservation Society moves to protect valuable habitats when threatened, Catherine replied evenly. The northern section of Evergreen Ranch contains den sites for one of the last sustainable wolf populations in the region. Commissioner Thompson cleared his throat. Yes, well, while we respect conservation efforts, the territorial development takes precedence in matters of significant economic impact. Does it? Daniel challenged. Even when that development directly benefits private interests with questionable acquisition methods? Thompson paled slightly. I'm not sure I understand your implication, Mr. Hawkins. Daniel held the commissioner's gaze steadily. I believe you do, sir, particularly regarding the connection between copper deposits, railroad routes, and certain tax assessments. Wilson stepped forward aggressively. Careful with accusations, Hawkins. Slander carries consequences. As does corruption, Daniel replied without flinching. Commissioner Thompson, I wonder if the governor is aware that the proposed route deviation conveniently crosses land containing significant copper deposits? Deposits that Mr. Hollister has been quietly investigating for months? A tense silence fell over the gathering. The commissioner glanced nervously at his companions before responding. The route was determined based on engineering surveys and cost considerations, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Then you won't object to postponing any decision until after the federal conservation review, Catherine interjected smoothly, and perhaps until after the governor has reviewed certain tax assessment documents we've recently acquired. Wilson's hand moved subtly toward his weapon, but Daniel's ranch hands had positioned themselves strategically around the visitors. The enforcer reconsidered, settling for a venomous glare. Commissioner Thompson seemed to age years in moments as he recognized the precariousness of his position. Perhaps a compromise might be considered. The commission could approve an alternative route that avoids the designated conservation area, while still serving the territory's development needs, Catherine added helpfully. The Conservation Society has no objection to progress that respects natural resources. Daniel studied the commissioner thoughtfully. I would consider granting right-of-way along my eastern boundary, well away from the wolf territories and any mineral deposits. At standard compensation rates, of course. The relief on Thompson's face was evident. That seems a reasonable accommodation. We could amend the proposal immediately. Wilson stepped forward, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Mr. Hollister will not— Mr. Hollister is not present, Daniel interrupted firmly. And this negotiation concerns the Territorial Commission and myself as the landowner. He turned back to Thompson. I assume the commission retains its independence in these matters? The implied threat was clear. If Thompson admitted Hollister's control over commission decisions, he would be confessing to corruption that could end his career when presented to the governor. After a moment of visible internal struggle, Thompson straightened his posture. The commission acts in the territory's best interest, Mr. Hawkins. If you're amenable to granting right-of-way along the eastern boundary, we can proceed with that arrangement. Wilson's face contorted with fury. This isn't the end, Hawkins. Mr. Hollister will— We'll need to accept that some battles aren't worth fighting, came a new voice from the edge of the gathering. All heads turned to see Judge Morgan approaching on horseback, his judicial dignity undiminished by travel dust. Behind him rode his daughter Rebecca, her expression a mixture of relief and determination. The judge dismounted with the assistance of one of Daniel's men, surveying the assembled group with practiced authority. Commissioner Thompson, an unusual venue for official business. Thompson paled further. Judge Morgan, we weren't expecting your return until next week. Evidently, the judge replied dryly. My daughter sent a most concerning telegram regarding certain irregular proceedings in my absence. I cut my circuit short to investigate personally. Wilson had gone very still, his calculating gaze shifting between the judge and Rebecca, who met his scrutiny without flinching. Judge Morgan turned to Daniel. Mr. Hawkins, I understand you've proposed an alternate right-of-way solution? Yes, Your Honor. Along the eastern boundary, preserving both the conservation area and the ranch's operations. The judge nodded approvingly. A reasonable compromise. He fixed Thompson with a penetrating stare. I trust the commission recognizes the wisdom of this approach, particularly given the federal conservation designation now in effect. Thompson nodded quickly. We were just discussing the amended proposal, Judge. I believe it satisfies all legitimate territorial interests. Excellent, Judge Morgan stated firmly. Then I suggest you return to town and prepare the appropriate documentation for Mr. Hawkins' signature. He glanced significantly at Wilson. All parties will, of course, respect this resolution. Wilson's jaw clenched, but he remained silent and under the judge's authoritative gaze. After a tense moment, he turned abruptly and mounted his horse, departing without another word. As the commissioners and their entourage prepared to leave, Rebecca approached Catherine and Daniel. Father received my telegram 2 days ago. I explained everything, the tax manipulation, the copper deposits, even Wilson's threats. A considerable risk, Catherine observed, genuine admiration in her voice. Rebecca smiled slightly. As you once noted, De Blake, some things are worth defending. She glanced at her father, who was speaking privately with Daniel. Father has suspected Hollister's methods for some time but lacked concrete evidence. Your documentation provides the beginning of a case against him. And your engagement? Catherine asked gently. Rebecca's smile turned bittersweet. Ended this morning. Father has arranged for me to study at a women's college in the East, far from Hollister's influence. Her expression brightened. I'm considering medicine, inspired by your example. After the visitors departed, Daniel, Catherine, and Judge Morgan gathered in the study to discuss next steps. The judge examined their evidence with professional scrutiny. Not yet sufficient for criminal charges, he concluded, but enough to warrant an official investigation by the governor's office. He looked at Daniel with newfound respect. You've handled this with remarkable restraint, Mr. Hawkins. Many in your position would have resorted to more direct methods. Daniel nodded acknowledgement. Violence solves nothing permanently, Your Honor. I learned that in the war. As their discussion concluded, Judge Morgan prepared to depart. Hollister will retreat strategically, but don't mistake that for surrender. Men of his ambition rarely abandon profitable pursuits entirely. We'll remain vigilant, Daniel assured him. Once the judge had gone, Catherine and Daniel found themselves alone in the study, the weight of recent events settling around them as evening approached. We prevailed, Catherine said quietly. For now, Daniel agreed, though your conservation designation was the decisive factor. My evidence alone might not have swayed Thompson. A fortunate collaboration, Catherine observed. Science and stewardship working together. Daniel moved to the window, gazing out at the land he had fought to protect. Dr. Bennett arrives in 3 days. Will you continue your research here? The question carried implications beyond the scientific. Catherine joined him at the window, their shoulders nearly touching. My work is far from complete, she replied carefully. The wolf studies require at least another season of observation, and there are other research questions I've only begun to explore. Daniel turned to face her, something vulnerable and hopeful in his expression. Including the possibility of medical reassessment we discussed? Catherine met his gaze directly. If you're willing, Dr. Bennett is one of the foremost experts in reproductive medicine. She could provide answers about your condition with far greater certainty than battlefield surgeons could. 15 years I've lived with their verdict, Daniel said softly. never questioning, never hoping for anything different. Science advances, Catherine replied. What was impossible yesterday becomes possible today. She hesitated, then added more personally, and sometimes people find possibilities they never anticipated. Daniel's hand moved to cover hers where it rested on the windowsill. The simple contact conveyed more than words could express. Whatever Dr. Bennett determines, he said quietly, these past weeks have changed something fundamental for me. You've brought a different kind of life to Evergreen, Catherine. One I didn't know was missing. Catherine turned her hand to intertwine her fingers with his. For a scientist, I've been remarkably blind to certain data, she admitted with a small smile. Specifically how a stubborn mountain man could become essential to my own happiness. Outside, the sun was setting over the Teton Mountains, painting the valley in golden light. Inside, two people who had expected solitary paths found themselves contemplating a shared journey, regardless of what medical science might ultimately determine about Daniel's condition. The arrival of Dr. Elizabeth Bennett transformed both Catherine's research and Daniel's understanding of himself. The distinguished physician brought not just advanced medical equipment, but decades of expertise challenging conventional medical wisdom. Battlefield medicine, she explained during their first evening at the ranch, necessarily prioritizes survival over nuance. What seemed absolute during wartime often proves more complex under proper examination. Daniel submitted to her thorough examination with quiet dignity, though Catherine could sense his tension. Years of accepting a medical sentence had built walls around certain hopes. The waiting after the examination proved even more difficult, as Dr. Bennett required several days to analyze her findings. When they finally gathered in Catherine's cabin laboratory, autumn painted the valley in golds and reds. Dr. Bennett arranged her notes carefully before addressing them both. The physicians who treated you at Gettysburg weren't wrong given what they knew then, she began, her voice carrying the precision of a scientist and the compassion of a healer. The trauma was severe, the damage extensive, but they lacked our current understanding of the body's capacity for regeneration over time. Daniel sat perfectly still, his face revealing nothing, though Catherine noticed the white-knuckled grip on his hat. You have experienced partial recovery, Mr. Hawkins, Dr. Bennett continued. While your reproductive capacity remains significantly reduced, it is not absent. Conception would be challenging, but entirely possible with the right partner in sufficient time. The stillness in the room deepened as Daniel absorbed this revelation that rewrote 15 years of certainty. Catherine felt a profound shift in the energy between them, possibility where there had been resignation. I should give you both some privacy, Dr. Bennett said quietly, gathering her papers. There's much to consider. After she departed, Daniel and Catherine sat in silence for several minutes. The possibility that had seemed so remote now transformed into potential reality. All these years, Daniel finally said, his voice rough with emotion, living with certainty that the Hawkins line would end with me. Catherine moved her chair closer to his. Science can provide information, Daniel, but what matters is what we choose to do with it. He looked at her, vulnerability and hope mingled in his expression. And what would you choose, Catherine Blake? You came here for research, not to be entangled with a battle-scarred rancher and his land disputes. Catherine smiled gently. I came following scientific questions, but I've found answers to questions I didn't know to ask. She took his hand in hers, about what matters beyond career ambitions, about the kind of partner who would challenge and support me in equal measure. Daniel brought her hand to his lips in a gesture of profound tenderness. I have nothing to offer but this land, this legacy, and a heart that's yours if you want it. A substantial offering, Catherine replied softly. One I'd be honored to accept. Winter arrived with heavy snows that blanketed Evergreen Ranch in pristine white. The territorial governor's investigation into Franklin Hollister's business practices had forced the banker to retreat to eastern financial circles. His influence in Wyoming significantly diminished. Judge Morgan oversaw a comprehensive review of tax assessments throughout the region, restoring fairness to a system long manipulated for private gain. Samuel Hayes's barn had been rebuilt with help from neighboring ranchers, stronger than before. Rebecca Morgan wrote regularly from her women's college, her letters full of excitement about medical studies and a future dedicated to healing. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside, Daniel stood on the porch of the main house watching Catherine approach from her cabin, bundled against the cold. No longer merely a visiting researcher, she had become essential to Evergreen's future. The wolves are denning early this year, she reported, stamping snow from her boots before entering, a good sign for spring births. Daniel smiled, helping her remove her heavy coat. Nature finds its way, as someone wise once told me. Inside, Mrs. Winters had decorated the house with evergreen boughs and red ribbons. A massive pine tree stood in the corner of the sitting room, adorned with handmade ornaments and candles waiting to be lit. That evening, after a festive dinner with the ranch hands and their families, Daniel and Catherine sat before the fireplace, watching flames dance over seasoned pine logs. The comfortable silence between them spoke of a connection that had deepened through shared purpose and mutual respect. "I received a letter from my brother today," Daniel said finally. "He and his wife are considering returning from California now that Hollister's influence has waned." "That's wonderful news," Catherine responded warmly. Daniel nodded. "James writes that he misses the mountains, says the ocean never quite felt like home." He paused, then added more hesitantly, "He also asked about you. Seems my letters have mentioned you with some frequency." Catherine smiled. "And what did you tell him?" Daniel reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "I told him I was hoping to introduce you as more than a research scientist when he arrives." He opened the box, revealing a ring of simple elegance, a single diamond set in burnished gold. "If you would do me the honor." Catherine looked from the ring to Daniel's face, seeing in his eyes all the hope and love he had learned to express without words. "Yes," she answered simply. "With all my heart, yes." As Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, Catherine reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them together. She had come to Wyoming seeking scientific discoveries, never imagining she would find a partner, a purpose, and a home in this world-beautiful country. As Catherine's acceptance hung in the air, the reality of their commitment settled around them like the gentle snowfall outside. Daniel's weathered face transformed with a smile so unguarded that Catherine realized how rare such moments had been before she entered his life. "We should tell the others," she said, looking toward the main house where sounds of celebration continued. "Tomorrow," Daniel replied, drawing her closer. "Tonight belongs just to us." News of their engagement spread through the territory like wildfire in the weeks that followed. Some neighboring ranchers exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen the change in Daniel long before he recognized it himself. Samuel Hayes offered his barn for the ceremony, though Daniel respectfully declined, wanting Catherine to become mistress of Evergreen on its own ground. Mrs. Winters took command of the household preparations with military precision, while Catherine found herself the unexpected recipient of quilts, preserves, and handmade lace from neighboring women who had watched the taciturn rancher's solitary existence with quiet concern for years. "You've brought him back to the living," one elderly woman whispered, pressing Catherine's hands and gnarled fingers. "Before you came, he was just existing." Planning their future brought conversations neither had expected to have. Catherine wrote to the Conservation Society, negotiating a permanent research position in Wyoming rather than returning to Chicago. Daniel found himself discussing bedroom curtains and kitchen expansions with the same serious consideration he gave to cattle breeding decisions. "Are you certain about this?" Daniel asked one evening as they reviewed architectural drawings for modernizing parts of the ranch house. "You'd be trading a distinguished academic career for life in the wilderness." Catherine looked up from the plans, her expression thoughtful. "Science doesn't end at city limits, Daniel. Some of the most important biological research in history was conducted in remote locations." She covered his hand with hers. "Besides, what better laboratory than 5,000 acres of protected wilderness? Our children will grow up understanding both books and land." And the casual mention of children, now a possibility rather than an impossibility, still brought a look of wonder to Daniel's face that Catherine treasured each time she saw it. Outside, snow continued falling, blanketing Evergreen Ranch in hushed tranquility. Inside, two people who had once accepted solitary futures embraced the promise of a shared life, proving that sometimes the most important discoveries weren't recorded in scientific journals, but written in the heart. 30 years later, Daniel Hawkins watched his grandchildren from the wide porch of Evergreen Ranch, the same porch where he had once struggled to express his feelings to Catherine. At 68, his face had weathered into a map of a life fully lived, each line earned through struggle, joy, and the daily work of building something lasting. "Grandfather, tell it again!" Young James, named for Daniel's brother, who had returned from California to help run the ranch's legal affairs, raced up the steps. At 8 years old, he had his grandmother's inquisitive nature and his grandfather's quiet strength. Which story would that be? Daniel asked, though he knew perfectly well which one. The blizzard, James insisted, his sisters Elizabeth and Sarah crowding behind him. Elizabeth, 10, already showed the scientific mind of her grandmother, while Sarah, 6, had the gentle spirit of Daniel's mother. Catherine squeezed Daniel's hand, silver threading through her once dark hair, but her eyes as bright as the day they met. You'd think after hearing it 100 times. It never gets old, Daniel replied softly just for her. Their eldest son Thomas appeared at the door, so like his father at 35 that it sometimes startled Daniel. Don't tire them out with too many stories, Father. Mother promised to show Elizabeth how to use the microscope tonight. And I always keep my promises, Catherine said with a smile. Thomas had followed his mother into science, now teaching at the university in Denver, but bringing his family home for summers. Their daughter Margaret had chosen medicine like Rebecca Morgan, who had become a respected physician in Chicago. Their youngest, William, managed the ranch alongside his father and uncle, ensuring the Hawkins legacy would continue for generations. As Daniel began the familiar tale, he found himself not just recounting events, but marveling at how a single storm had altered the course of so many lives. The copper beneath Evergreen had eventually been mined, but on the Hawkins terms, with profits supporting conservation efforts throughout the territory. Hollister had faded into obscurity, his schemes undone by his own greed, while Judge Morgan had gone on to serve on the territorial Supreme Court. The blizzard of '85 changed everything, Daniel began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of gratitude. Before that storm, I had accepted that the Hawkins line would end with me. I had made my peace with it, or so I thought. When the children finally dispersed for dinner, Daniel and Catherine remained on the porch, watching stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky, just as they had on countless nights before. Do you ever wonder, Catherine asked, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder, what might have happened if that blizzard hadn't stranded me? Daniel considered this, watching the light from the windows spill onto the yard where 3 generations of Hawkins now gathered. Some things are meant to be, Dr. Blake, he said, using her professional title as he sometimes did when feeling particularly tender. Though perhaps we would have found each other by a different path. Catherine smiled at the old endearment. The scientist in me questions destiny, Mr. Hawkins. And what does the woman in you say? He asked, drawing her closer as the evening chills settled over the valley they had fought to protect. Catherine gazed at the home they had built, not just the structures, but the family within them, the principles that would outlast them both. The wolves still ran in the northern forests, their populations restored through Catherine's pioneering work. The ranch had become a model of conservation and responsible stewardship, hosting researchers from universities across the country. That sometimes, she admitted, the heart discovers truths that science can only confirm later. Daniel pressed a kiss to her silver hair, filled with the quiet wonder that had never diminished over their years together. The most important discovery of my life was you. Above them, stars wheeled in ancient patterns over Evergreen Ranch, while inside the house, the voices of children and grandchildren mingled with laughter. The mountain man who thought he'd never have an heir had become the patriarch of a thriving dynasty. His legacy secured not just through birth, but through the values of love, courage, and stewardship that would echo through generations yet unborn.